Hi, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Perfect Prey. I'm glad you're here. My name is Dr. Christine Marie Cocchiola, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have a doctorate in clinical social welfare, where I researched coercive control and the impact on both adult and child victims. Most importantly, I am a survivor and a protective parent. Victims and survivors of coercive control are never to blame, but I chose the name Perfect Prey because coercive controllers, who are individuals who apparently have characterologically disordered personalities, do choose who to prey upon. They choose people who tend to be agreeable and conscientious, perhaps loyal to a fault, fixers, optimistic, and empathic. Or these coercive controllers prey upon those who are most vulnerable, including our children. It's part of their plan to gain control. How do we help our children when they're experiencing systematic, unacknowledged child abuse? We need to understand how these coercive controllers, harmful individuals, attempt to exert their power over us and our children. We need to look beyond a trauma-informed lens, but also layer it with a coercive control lens. So let's engage in personal power conversations that will create the protective parts that will derail the coercive controller from his plans. Hey everyone, welcome back to Perfect Prey, my podcast where we talk about the experiences of victims, survivors of coercive control, narcissistic abuse. And as many of you know, I've been trying to highlight the experiences of children. Tina Swithin is doing this campaign, The Children Are Coming, and I am so honored to have Ashton Goff here to talk about his own experiences. What we know is that children of coercive control suffer similarly, and if not more so than the adult victim, because their brains are developing, right? And the trauma to the developing brain is significant. And as you all know, my tagline is it's a malicious fracturing of attachment when an abuser does just about anything to hurt the protective parent. So I'm so glad that you're here and you're listening, and I'm grateful to have Ashton here. So thank you for being here, Ashton.
Of course, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So maybe I think our listeners probably need to know a little bit about, where your story starts and a little bit about you. So thank you. Would you please?
Yeah, sure. So my parents got divorced in 2010, and when I was 8 years old, and I have a little brother, he was 3 at the time. And growing up, my dad wasn't around very much anyway. So when my parents got divorced initially, it really wasn't that big of a change, but we started seeing him every other Friday for dinner. And then the courts kept upping that time. But as a kid, my dad was abusive towards me mostly, and a little bit towards my brother, mostly emotionally abusive to my brother, but other kinds of abusive towards me. And my dad and I never really had a very good relationship when I was a kid. And so I was very resistant to spending more time with him alone. He was also abusive to my mom, so my mom kind of understood, how I was feeling. And eventually they upped our time to 5 days a week, Wednesday to Monday, every other week. And, we made the best of that, what we could do. And there were instances where I didn't want to go and whatnot, but I always ended up going. And then there was a week where I was feeling sick and I didn't want to go to school. I was in 8th grade at the time, so I was about 14 years old, or maybe I just turned 14. And my dad made me go to school, even though I was feeling sick. And so when I got to school, I called my mom and asked her to come pick me up, because I was feeling very sick. And so she came and picked me up, and my dad, who had been tracking my phone or whatever, saw that I had left school, and he believes that I cut school and walked home, because my mom lived about, half a mile from my middle school. And he showed up after she had dropped me back off home. She had to go back to work, and she made sure I was okay and dropped me off. Then my dad showed up screaming and banging on the door. And luckily, one of our neighbors saw what was happening and called my mom, and she came back. And then my dad called the police, And the police said that, I was clearly showing signs of being sick. So there's nothing we're going to do about this. And they asked my dad to leave. And then at that point, I didn't feel like I would be safe for me to go back once I had openly kind of defied my dad. And I'd always kept my fear of him kind of private to myself, or told my mom about it, but I was always too afraid to express it to my dad. And so I decided I was never going to go back. And then after a year of not going there, the court ordered me and my brother was still following the same pattern of 5 days every other week, but the court ordered me to go into the parent reunification camp, Family Bridges, with Linda Gottlieb in New York. And there was supposed to be a 90-day no contact period between me and my mom and her family. But then I didn't see her again for 3.5 years.
Absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
Sorry. Every time I hear these stories, they're just as shocking every single time. And remind our listeners how old you were when this happened.
Yeah, I was 14 when it started. And then eventually my dad wanted me to testify. After 3.5 years, my dad wanted me to testify that I wanted him to have sole permanent custody. And I wasn't going to be able to do that. One, I wasn't going to lie. And two, I wanted to see my mom again. So I ended up running away right the week before COVID hit Delaware in 2020. And so I ran away. I was 17 and a half, almost 18 at the time. And when I ran away, my dad reported me as a runaway to the Delaware Department of Family Services. Eventually, I ran away to a friend's house near where my mom lived, and the Department of Family Services came and did an interview with me, and they felt that I was safe where I was. And then I had gotten a protection from abuse order, and I regret doing this now, but at the time I just wanted to get away from my dad. I made a trade essentially with him that I would drop the protection from abuse order in exchange for him not trying to get me back in a custody battle. So in hindsight, I probably should have kept that order, but at the end of the day, I got to see my mom again. And luckily, we have always had a good relationship, and we still do. And I mean, I don't live near her anymore, but we still talk every day, and I come and visit her and she comes and visit me. And luckily that all worked out, but I still haven't seen my brother. He's still with my dad, which is very upsetting to me because of all the things that I experienced while I was there. My dad being abusive and the therapists trying to trick me into believing what they were saying about my mom. I have a little bit of, I don't know what I would call them. I don't know, mental issues, or I don't know what you'd call it, but trauma issues that still affect me.
Sure.
Make it sometimes a little difficult.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to help you reframe that because, certainly you can call it mental health issues, but this was something brought upon you. Right. And it was something that no child deserves to experience ever.
100%.
And, I think what people don't recognize is that when children are in any way forced, coerced into saying or doing things that they don't truly at their core want to do, and it's really not up to the adults to figure out, if the child does or doesn't, if the child is expressing, if they are giving voice. Sadly, I have moms whose children are saying the bad things about them, right? And so, but the reality is that forcing a child into a situation where they are feeling like they're being detached from something that's so primal, the caretaker that they love and adore, is really extremely harmful to the developing brain. So it's not surprising to me. I would be very surprised if any children who have experienced this aren't suffering anxiety and some hypervigilance around certain things, and probably some significant trust issues, because you kind of went in this space of having all these providers who were telling you things that weren't true. They were trying to program you to believe something that wasn't true. It's a programming of brain. It's like a cult, right?
That's what I said.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. So I was thinking about a few things when you were talking, and, just the idea that the neighbors witnessed, him coming to the door and that you made a decision, but your brother was still going. Yet for some reason, your dad was able to convince the court that both of you needed to go off to reunification camp. I'm not sure I can wrap my head around that. Yeah.
I can't wrap my head around it either. My dad, not only were there incidents witnessed in my house, my dad previously had been found liable for child abuse by the Department of Family Services. He's a disbarred attorney. That's a pretty high standard to get disbarred. And I mean, the case is out there if anyone wants to read what happened. But I mean, this is not like my dad. Also, he'd been arrested many times for public intoxication and public nudity and things like that. So my dad's not a very good person. And it's not me just saying that, it's a documented fact. So I don't understand how this happened. My mom and I have talked about it, and I've talked about it with some other families and kids who have gone through this. And a lot of them feel that there's something behind the scenes that is going on that's encouraging these judges to go and put kids in these programs. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt. I think some of these judges maybe don't fully understand what they're talking about and I think that these parent alienation people are tricking some judges and some families into these programs. But I also think that there may be something more malicious going on that people need to figure out.
I think you're probably right. I think you probably know I recently published a book called Framed, Woman in the Family Court Underworld. Every single story, I had a colleague reach out to me today and say, could this actually be as prevalent as you say it is? And I'm like, oh, it is. And that's the sad part.
It is. Yeah.
Right. Right. And so, I'm a therapist. And when you mention therapists and the gaslighting that goes on over and over again, where children are forced into repair therapy with an abuser, forced to spend time, forced to pretend they like the person when they actually have felt unsafe. And you had every indication. And by the way, like you said, evidence to prove why you might be afraid.
Right.
Yeah.
And even when we were in this program, our family reunification camp was like a 4-day thing in New York. And then it was after care or after therapy with a therapist in Delaware. So ours was Dr. Rachel Brandenburg. And I was physically assaulted by my dad in her office in front of her. And she did nothing about it. And as far as I know, I'm pretty sure that she is a mandated reporter.
Oh, yes.
And there's been some issues with that. And I can't even understand, this judge accused me of making all these things up many times. And it was hurtful to me as a kid and more hurtful to me as almost an adult. But what more do you want from me?
Right. Right. No, what you're pointing out, and I think that's the other thing, a lot of people, like this person who reached out to me, but in general, people don't really believe that there is evidence against these abusers and that the evidence is being ignored, and that therapists and custody evaluators and forensic evaluators and guardian ad litems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even your dad's attorney, obviously, are participating in this. It is collusion to rob a child from, and I'll go back to my own training as a social worker and someone who researches, but literally robbing a child of the attachment that matters more to them than anything on the planet. And, how harmful that is. And again, resiliency is there. We can heal from these things, but man, the fact that there would be other players, or I think some people call them actors, actually participating in this. And I don't think the system recognizes how important attachment is. There's certainly that, but why not actually look into it or ask about it?
Right.
And then look at the evidence against a perpetrator and say, okay, there's enough evidence. I mean, we don't need, hundreds of horrible things. We've had 5 horrible things.
I had 2 judges throughout our family court case. One was a little bit more, even we went through 4 court-ordered therapists before we went to Turning Points with Linda Gottlieb. And all of those other therapists were on my side. They expressed to the court that I had valid reasons for being afraid of my dad, and they had met with my dad and they didn't find him to be a good guardian. So to us, it felt like they kept doing it until they found the answer that they were looking for. They already had the predetermined answer. They just wanted someone to confirm it for them or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and it was very frustrating. I don't how am I ever supposed to trust these people? And that's one of my issues now, is that I really struggle to trust these lawyers and judges, and I struggle to trust therapists just because I've been burned a couple of times.
Mhm.
pretty severely. So, yeah,
Absolutely. And what's interesting is I think when you do find a therapist who does get it, like you had some you're
yeah,
saying, the other thing is there's a fear of actually testifying against an abuser because
right.
these abusers are the first people to report us to, I mean, I've been reported to licensing boards as
Yeah,
being,
two of those therapists that I saw lost their licenses.
they lost their license.
Yes.
I have not had that. I've not heard of that occurring, but that is right. So, you just think about, you know, the system is very strong and powerful. And abusers have lots of power also.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. So, the 4 days that you had to be with your dad, I'm sure you don't have to relay, but I'm sure overwhelming and distressing. And then that time away from your mom. Can you tell us a little bit about just how you coped with not seeing her and obviously I'm guessing you were a protective factor for your brother. Yeah.
Well, I would take credit for a lot of the things my brother did wrong, just because at that point, my brother was still very young when we went. He was 9 when we started the program. I was always pretty protective of him. I'm 5 years older than him. So, and we were good, close. I would just take the abuse for him because I didn't even, at one point you get to a point where you just don't even care. Like it's like a numb thing. It doesn't matter. But when we were in the first 4 days, it was really weird, really, because my dad's always such a good person, like in public, in front of,
Performative.
yeah, exactly. Performative is a great, yeah, perfect word, in front of these people, and performative even to me, because at that point I hadn't seen him in a year.
Hmm.
So I think he was trying to get me to let my guard down, but I was relatively silent for those first 4 days. But to cope, I spent as much time I could at school. This is the one place I was really allowed to go by myself. I had to change schools. They made me change schools for this program.
Some friends you
Lost-
lost.
I lost all my friends. I've put in a lot of work trying to reconnect with some of my friends from when I was a kid, and luckily, I've gotten like maybe two or three back. I was pretty social as a child, and and my mom put me into like sports and stuff as a kid, and so I had a lot of friends, and unfortunately, I've lost a lot of them. But I made good friends in high school, and because I spent as much time as I could there, and so to cope, I spent as much time as I could away, and then I don't know what you'd call it, but I put on a facade maybe of when I was with him and when I was in these, therapy appointments. Just it's caused me some, I don't know what you call it, but now I talk to myself a lot and I don't like it very much. My mom says, "Why are you so mean to yourself?" I, I tell myself to shut up a lot. It's really me just trying to like ignore what I'm thinking.
Right. Because you had to do that all the
Yeah,
time in therapy.
exactly. I have a pretty good memory. I have a very vivid memory. So I remember every little thing that's happened to me for the most part. I can go back all the way to now when I was like 5 years old, or 4 years old. Like I try to push some of these worst thoughts out of my mind to try to replace them with better memories. Probably not a perfect way of doing it, but
Disassociate from the bad stuff, right? And then when you were in therapy, you actually had to disassociate from your true feelings. So it's like talk about a conflict. Yeah,
exactly.
right? I mean, yeah, there's quite
I
a lot
put
of
on
conflict going on there. Yeah.
so I put on a pretty strong facade, and my dad would do things to me. I would just accept it and move on. And that was eventually just get to the point where it's just kind of numb and doesn't really affect you anymore. And that's actually made him more mad. Like I just didn't care. And with like the last year, my dad had gotten remarried when I was like 12-ish. When we went there, we were living with him, his new wife, and her two children. And I got along decently with her two children. Actually, we're close now, but they ended up getting divorced while I was there. Like right before they had gotten divorced, I was just so numb. I was after like 2 years of being there. I was just so numb to all of it that he would be screaming and yelling at me. And when he was done doing whatever he was going to do to me, he would always make me have like these like 3 hour conversations with him and his wife about whatever was happening. And I just gave up on that. Like at that point, I was like, what are you going to do to me at this point? You can do whatever you want.
Torture, though, kind of, I mean, it feels a little bit like torture. Abusers like to keep us engaged in conversations that we don't even want to be engaged in anymore, right? And here you are, a young boy. You're not even an adult, you know? Yeah.
They wouldn't let me eat or things like that for a couple days or slept outside a lot. But you know, it can only get so bad, right? It wasn't ever about me either. It was something that I struggled to understand at the time. It was never really about me. My dad has his own issues, and it was always about, for him, this custody stuff was never even about wanting to be with me or,
Yeah.
be with his, it was just about winning for him. He wanted to beat my mom and or cause her as much pain as he could. So my mom has had a happy life since she has gotten divorced. She has a boyfriend that they've been dating for since she got divorced, and he's a great guy. And she has a happy life, and not seeing us was very hard for her, but she still was happy as she could be. And I think that always bugged my dad because he was
Sure.
never happy, even when he had everything he wanted.
Right. So abusers really can't be happy, right? And they don't have the ability to love. And it's so sad, I think, when children realize that it wasn't even about, like you just said, it wasn't even about me and it's not about your brother. It's actually, you're just objects. They objectify children and the kids know that. And that's like a whole nother layer of trauma, right? It's a betrayal, like someone that's supposed to care about you and love you. But to your point, this is your dad's issue, right? And, the very good news is that you and apparently your brother, we're going to assume, right, are going to be okay and are okay as soon as you're able to have the freedom from him.
Yeah, once I got away from him, I mean, my life definitely got better, and I went to college and I live with my girlfriend now, and I've got a good life. I've got a good job, and I really struggle the most right now is with my sleeping. I have these very vivid night terrors, and they come and go. But like this last week, I haven't been able to sleep very well, and it comes every once in a while, and that is very frustrating to me because I really just want to put this all behind me, and I've worked very hard to get to where I've gotten to, but it's still, it might be something that I always live with. I don't know, but I hate to say like it's not fair,
It's
not fair.
not, but it's
It's very,
not.
it's very frustrating to me, and I know I've spoken to other kids who have gone through this, and some of them are experiencing a lot worse than I am, and that's very frustrating to me that any of this had to happen in the first place.
Well, the point is right, is that none of it had to happen. And you were supposed to be able to just live with your mom and have as peaceful an upbringing as possible. And that was all taken from you. I'm so sorry you're not sleeping. And I can't help myself. I know you don't necessarily trust therapists, but I promise there's a good therapist out there who can help you with sleep and regulation because what you've gone through is pretty much, I always say that these experiences are about the worst kind because society in general doesn't even really see, like, unless you're in this world, others don't even know this is happening, nor do they even think of it as being, oh, really? That happens? Or is it really that big of a deal? Or they don't understand the context of it. Of course, I'm so sorry for what you experienced. I'm so grateful that you're willing to share it. And, I'm hopeful your brother comes home soon and comes back to you and your mom. I mean, that's obviously something I'm sure you're both hoping for. And I think your mom, in the circumstances, probably did what's right, which is to live her life so that when you guys did come back, she wasn't broken, right? You knew she hadn't been broken by him.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's a great role model that he can't break you either, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I hate to say I'm proud of my mom because I don't want to be like condescending, but I am very proud of her because they wanted her to write these letters while we were there, basically admitting her guilt, which she refused to do because she wasn't guilty. I mean, she's not, my mom was a terrible liar. She didn't write these letters and she didn't participate in their ridiculous program. And so, and she kind of accepted the consequences of that and kind of, I think she trusted, and I appreciate that. I think that she trusted me to, figure out a way back, And when we were in this program, right before I ran away, I was at a cross country meet and I saw her. I ended up running up to her and giving her a hug, and we were, a little bit of tears and whatnot. But I saw her then, but then it was another like 6 months until I was able to see her again. So I think that really helped me then because helped me, you know, get some little bit of hope at that point because I had relegated myself to just saying, like, when I go to college, that'll be it. I'll just go to college, cut my dad off, and then we'll be done. Luckily, well, no, maybe not luckily, but just the way events played out, that's not how that happened. But I always remembered my mom, and I struggled to remember like what she looked like.
Mm.
I guess the weird thing, I remembered everything else about her, but I struggled to remember her face after a while.
It's quite amazing that you remembered everything you did because a part of you wasn't allowed to remember that,
Yeah.
at least out loud, right?
Well, yeah. And so right before I'd left, my mom got me this cross and I kept it for a long time, but eventually my dad lost it. So it's like everything that I had of her, though, eventually disappeared while I was with my dad, and my clothes and everything. Like all my clothes were replaced, everything I brought with me. So,
Any memories he wanted to
yeah,
wipe her away.
exactly. It was nerve-wracking even going there. People are probably familiar, but a lot of the kids are taken by force by, armed, I don't know what you call them, mercenaries to take them into these programs. I luckily didn't have to experience that, but I was threatened with that. But my mom had to drive me up there to New York. It started off scary.
Thank you so much. I mean, you've helped us so much. I think the idea is to spread the word and let people know and have people really become engaged, I hope, in educating family court professionals. But also, I always say we need good people on the ground now, like in the system. And the only way to do that is for people to actually acknowledge there's a problem. There's a huge problem. It sounds kind of pipe dreamish, but how do we infiltrate the system with good people?
Right.
And that's really, I think we have to get rid of the sewage in the system. So yeah, I know it's a lot to come on. I know it's a lot to talk about it. I know that you do talk about it. And I think your voice is so important for all the people who can't or don't want to.
Yeah, I get why people don't want to talk about it. I mean, I don't mind talking about it now. I've talked about it a lot. It hurts. I've talked to a lot of moms who their kids have either gone into this program and gotten out, and some other moms that have been able to help keep their kids out of these programs. And so, I'm happy to talk to anybody who just needs someone to talk to, or someone who understands. I've talked to some kids who've gone through it, some younger kids, just because I understand how they feel. And so I've always been happy. And that's my way of maybe healing a little bit, is helping other people avoid these programs, or people who are unfortunately forced into them, help them when it's over.
Yeah. Thank you. You're already doing so much. You really
Yeah.
are. And I mean, I'm sure my listeners and everybody who's listening and viewing this is thinking, I hope you're taking care of yourself. And, I know you said, you've gone to college and you have a job and you have a whole new life and you get to talk to your mom regularly. We wish you the best for sure and appreciate everything that you do. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much for coming on. This podcast is for educational purposes only, and individuals should seek out appropriate medical or mental health services from a professional if they or anyone else they know is at risk of injury or harm. The views of this podcast and those discussed here are solely those of the podcast author and are not intended to represent anyone else's opinion.